February 19th, 1945. Outside the Belgian town of Elsenborn Ridge, Master Sergeant John Robert Earley stood in the freezing pre-dawn darkness, watching a column of M-four Sherman tanks roll past his position toward the German lines. Around him, infantrymen from the Second Infantry Division huddled in foxholes, their breath forming white clouds in the bitter cold. The temperature hovered near 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and ice crusted every surface. But it was not the cold that held Early's attention. It was the peculiar appearance of the lead Sherman tanks in the column, each one bristling with what looked like massive steel plates, bolted and welded to their hulls in irregular patterns that gave them the appearance of medieval ironclad warriors rather than modern fighting vehicles. Welded to the front glacis, the turret sides, and even portions of the sponsons were thick steel plates, salvaged from destroyed German tanks, railroad cars, and structural steel from bombed-out buildings. Some plates were 2 inches thick. Others were 3 or even 4 inches of solid steel, layered and overlapped to create composite armor that was crude, heavy, and utterly unlike anything approved by United States Army Ordnance specifications. The modifications had been performed not in a factory, not by trained engineers with advanced degrees, but in a makeshift field workshop by a former blacksmith from Kentucky who had applied nothing more sophisticated than welding torches, sledgehammers, and an intuitive understanding of how metal behaves under stress. This blacksmith, a 34-year-old technical sergeant named James Howard Bates, had transformed a dozen standard M-four Sherman tanks into armored monsters that could withstand German anti-tank fire that would have destroyed unmodified Shermans in seconds. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching. From today, the lead tank commander, Lieutenant Benjamin Kowalski, stood in his turret hatch despite the freezing temperature, one hand resting on the massive steel plate that now protected his turret front. He had watched Sergeant Bates weld that plate into position 3 days earlier, working through the night in a canvas-covered workshop lit by the orange glow of acetylene torches. Kowalski had been skeptical at first. The modification added nearly 3 tons to his tank's weight and reduced its top speed from 26 miles per hour to perhaps 22. The additional armor made the Sherman nose-heavy and slightly awkward to maneuver. But Kowalski had also seen what German Tiger and Panther tanks could do to standard Shermans, and he knew that speed meant nothing if you were dead before you could use it. The mission that morning was brutal in its simplicity and its danger. 1st Battalion, 33rd Armoured Regiment would advance through the Ardennes forest toward the town of Crewinkel, where German forces had established defensive positions anchored by at least 6 Tiger heavy tanks and supporting Panther medium tanks. Intelligence estimates suggested the Americans would face approximately 50 German tanks and assault guns in the sector, including a concentration of Tigers that represented one of the most formidable armoured forces remaining to the Wehrmacht in the West. American doctrine called for numerical superiority of at least 3-to-1 when engaging Tigers. The Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate a Tiger's side or rear armor at close range, but was nearly useless against the Tiger's frontal armor at any practical combat distance. Official Army tactics emphasized flanking maneuvers, combined arms coordination, and accepting that some Shermans would be lost to achieve kills on German heavy tanks. But Lieutenant Kowalski's platoon would not be following official doctrine that morning. His 5 Shermans, all modified by Sergeant Bates with improvised composite armor, would be testing a different approach. They would advance directly toward German positions, absorb the fire that would normally destroy them, and close to ranges where even the Sherman's modest gun could damage Tigers. The theory was simple. If the armor modifications worked, if Bates had correctly calculated the thickness and angles needed to defeat German anti-tank rounds, then modified Shermans could survive long enough to get close. and at close range, numbers would decide the battle. If the modifications failed, Kowalski and his crews would die in burning tanks, just like thousands of American tankers before them. The sky began to lighten in the east. Artillery fire erupted from American positions, a rolling barrage that crashed down on German defensive lines 2 miles distant. The bombardment would last 15 minutes, after which the armor would advance. Kowalski dropped into his turret and sealed the hatch above him. Inside the Sherman, the crew moved through their final preparations with the mechanical efficiency of men who had done this many times before. The gunner, Corporal Michael Chen, checked his sights and verified his ammunition loadout. Armor-piercing rounds for tanks, high explosive for infantry, and soft targets. The loader, Private First Class Robert DeMarco, arranged the ready rack for quick access. The driver, Technician 5th Grade William Harrison, tested his controls one final time, and the assistant driver, who also operated the hull machine gun, Private Leonard Martinez, chambered a round and checked his field of fire. The artillery barrage lifted at exactly 06:15 hours. Radio crackled with the battalion commander's voice. All units, advance. Maintain formation. Engage targets of opportunity. Harrison shifted into gear, and the Sherman lurched forward, trailing 4 other modified tanks in line abreast formation. The advance began slowly, grinding through snow-covered terrain at perhaps 8 miles per hour. The forest ahead was a dark mass of pine trees, their branches heavy with snow. German positions were invisible from this distance, but every man in every tank knew they were there, waiting. This is the story of how James Howard Bates, a blacksmith from rural Kentucky with no formal engineering training, improvised an armor modification that allowed outgunned American Sherman tanks to survive engagements with German Tigers and Panthers, changing the tactical calculus of armored warfare in the final months of World War II in Europe, and demonstrating that sometimes the most effective military innovations come not from research laboratories or engineering schools, but from practical men who understand their materials and are willing to improvise solutions to immediate problems. 3 months earlier, December 1944, the Ardennes Forest had erupted in the largest German offensive operation launched in the West since 1940. Operation Wacht Armee, Rhine, known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge, threw 29 German divisions, including 10 panzer divisions, against a lightly held sector of the American line in Belgium and Luxembourg. The offensive achieved complete tactical surprise. German forces penetrated up to 60 miles into American positions, creating a bulge in the Allied line that threatened to reach the Meuse River and potentially encircle 4 Allied armies. The German offensive was spearheaded by heavy tanks, particularly the Tiger and the King Tiger, that were nearly invulnerable to standard American anti-tank weapons at normal combat ranges. The Tiger heavy tank, designated Panzerkampfwagen VI Tiger Ausführung E, mounted an 88mm Quok 36 gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Its frontal armor was 100mm thick, sloped at angles that made penetration by the Sherman 75mm gun virtually impossible, except at point-blank range. The Tiger weighed 54 tons, nearly twice the weight of a Sherman, and its armor protection was correspondingly superior. American tank crews feared the Tiger with good reason. In Normandy during the summer of 1944, a single Tiger commanded by SS Obersturmführer Michael Whitman had destroyed an entire British armoured column, knocking out approximately 25 tanks and other vehicles in less than 15 minutes. The engagement at Villers-Bocage had become legendary among German tankers and nightmarish among Allied crews. The Tiger's combination of firepower, armour protection, and good optics made it a dominant weapon system that Allied tanks could defeat only through superior numbers, better tactics, and acceptance of heavy casualties. The Sherman medium tank, by contrast, was a compromised design that prioritized reliability, ease of production, and operational mobility over armor protection and firepower. The M-four Sherman mounted a 75mm M3 gun that was adequate against German medium tanks like the Panzer IV, but struggled against the heavier German armor that appeared in increasing numbers from 1943 onward. Sherman frontal armor was only 51mm thick on the hull front, barely adequate to stop German anti-tank rounds at medium ranges. The turret front was 76mm, somewhat better protected, but still vulnerable to German tank guns and anti-tank weapons at typical combat distances. American tank doctrine acknowledged these limitations and attempted to compensate through numbers and tactics. The standard approach when facing German heavy tanks was to use multiple Shermans working in coordination. Several tanks would maneuver to present threats from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing the German tank to choose which target to engage. While the Tiger was occupied with one Sherman, others would attempt to flank and engage its weaker side or rear armor. This tactic worked, but it was expensive. Army studies from the European theatre showed that on average, it took 4 to 5 Shermans to destroy a single Tiger, and typically 3 of those Shermans would be destroyed or disabled in the engagement. The human cost was staggering. Sherman crews suffered casualty rates that were among the highest of any branch of service in the European theatre. A tank crewman had roughly a 50% chance of being killed or wounded if his tank was penetrated by enemy fire. The Sherman's gasoline engine, though reliable, was prone to fires when the tank was hit. American tankers grimly referred to their vehicles as Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter whose advertising slogan promised "lights first time, every time." British tankers called them Tommy Cookers. The names reflected a brutal reality. Shermans burned when hit, and crews often had only seconds to escape before the fire reached ammunition storage and the tank exploded. By December 1944, American armoured units had suffered devastating losses during the autumn campaigns across France and into Germany. The 1st Armoured Division had lost more than 60% of its tank strength during fighting in the Vosges Mountains. The 3rd Armoured Division, which had spearheaded much of Patton's advance across France, had been rebuilt twice after losing most of its tanks to German fire. Replacement crews arriving from training bases in the United States were often inadequately prepared for the realities of combat against German armor. Training in the States emphasized maneuver and tactics, but could not replicate the psychological stress of facing an 88mm gun that could kill you from a mile away before you even saw the tank that fired it. When the German offensive exploded across the Ardennes on December 16, 1944, American tank units found themselves facing the largest concentration of German armor assembled in the West since Normandy. Among the German forces were heavy tank battalions equipped with Tigers and the even more formidable King Tiger, which mounted a longer 88mm gun and even heavier armor. American Shermans engaging these monsters suffered predictable results. Entire platoons were destroyed in engagements where German heavy tanks picked off American armor at ranges where the Shermans could not effectively return fire. The 2nd Armored Division, holding positions near Elsenborn Ridge, lost 14 tanks in the first 3 days of the German offensive. Most were destroyed by German tank fire before they could maneuver into positions where their guns would be effective. Tank commanders reported frustration and helplessness. They could see the German tanks. They could identify them as Tigers or Panthers, but they could not damage them frontally, and attempts to maneuver for flank shots exposed the Shermans to fire from German anti-tank guns and Panzerschreck, teams that were positioned in depth throughout the German defensive system. Into this crisis came Technical Sergeant James Howard Bates, a 34-year-old tanker from Hazard, Kentucky, who before the war had worked as a blacksmith and welder in the coal mining country of eastern Kentucky. Bates had enlisted in 1942 at age 32, older than most recruits, and had been assigned to armoured forces based on his metalworking experience. He had trained as a tank mechanic and had served with the Second Armoured Division since its deployment to England in 1943. He had participated in the Normandy invasion, fighting across France through the summer and autumn of 1944, and had survived engagements where better trained and more experienced crews had died. Bates understood metal. He understood how steel behaved under stress, how it could be shaped and joined, how thickness and angle affected its ability to stop projectiles. He had spent years, before the war, working with his hands, fabricating tools and equipment for coal mines where failure could mean death for miners working underground. He approached problems methodically, testing his assumptions, learning from failures, refining his techniques. These were not skills taught in military schools. They were the accumulated knowledge of a craftsman who had spent 2 decades working with metal and solving practical problems. In mid-December 1944, during a brief lull in combat operations, Bates had been assigned to a maintenance company supporting the Second Armoured Division. His duties included repairing damaged tanks, fabricating replacement parts that were not available through supply channels, and performing modifications requested by unit commanders. The work was routine until the German offensive began, and shattered tanks began arriving at the maintenance area in numbers that overwhelmed the repair capacity. Bates examined the destroyed Shermans with the eye of a craftsman analyzing failed work. He noted the penetration points where German rounds had punched through armor. He measured the thickness of Sherman armor plates and compared them mentally to the German rounds that had defeated them. He examined captured German anti-tank rounds when they were available, studying their design and estimating the energy they carried. And he began to formulate ideas about how additional armor might be applied to Shermans to improve their chances of survival. The concept was not entirely original. Tankers in Normandy had experimented with appliqué armor, attaching additional steel plates to vulnerable areas of their tanks. Some crews had welded spare track links to their hulls, creating crude additional armor that provided some protection against Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck rounds. Soviet tank crews on the Eastern Front had developed elaborate schemes for attaching sandbags, concrete, and spare armor plates to their 34 tanks. The principle was well established. More armor meant better protection. But Bates's approach was more systematic and more ambitious than previous improvised armor schemes. He studied the angles at which German rounds typically struck Shermans, based on examination of destroyed vehicles. He calculated, using nothing more than basic geometry and practical experience, the additional thickness needed to stop German 88mm armor-piercing rounds. He identified sources of suitable steel, including destroyed German tanks in salvage yards, structural steel from damaged buildings, and even railroad rails from bombed-out train yards. And he developed welding techniques that could join dissimilar metals and create composite armor structures that were stronger than simple stacked plates. His first experimental modification was performed on a knocked-out Sherman that had been hit multiple times and was waiting to be scrapped for parts. Bates spent 3 days in late December working on the side, the hull, attaching thick steel plates to the frontal armor using a combination of welding and bolting. He layered the plates at slight angles to each other, creating air gaps between layers that he believed would help dissipate the energy of impacting rounds. The result was crude and heavy, adding nearly 4 tons to the tank's weight, but Bates believed it would work. Testing the modification required approval from his battalion commander and access to a firing range, both of which were difficult to obtain during the height of the German offensive. But Bates was persistent. He prepared sketches and calculations, such as they were, and presented them to his company commander, Captain Thomas Reynolds. Reynolds was skeptical but willing to listen. He had lost too many tanks and too many crews to dismiss any potential solution, no matter how unconventional. Reynolds forwarded Bates's proposal to the battalion ordnance officer, who in turn brought it to the attention of Colonel William Hamrick, commanding the 33rd Armoured Regiment. Hamrick authorized limited testing, primarily because the tactical situation was desperate and conventional approaches were producing unacceptable casualties. If Bates's improvised armour could save even a few tanks, it was worth investigating. The test firing took place on December 28, 1944, at a range established behind American lines near the town of Verviers in Belgium. The modified Sherman, still bearing the scars of previous combat damage, was positioned at various ranges from a captured German 75mm anti-tank gun. American ordnance officers wanted to test the armour against German weapons using captured ammunition to ensure the results would be realistic. The first shot was fired from 800 metres, a typical combat range in the close terrain of the Ardennes. The German 75mm armour-piercing round struck the modified frontal armour with a sound like a massive hammer blow. Observers watching through binoculars saw the impact, saw the flash of metal on metal, and saw the round deflect upward without penetrating. The steel plates had held. Bates's armour had stopped a round that would have penetrated standard Sherman armour and killed the crew. Additional shots were fired at various ranges and angles. Not every round was defeated. Some shots that struck at near perpendicular angles drove through the improvised armour and penetrated the hull beneath. But the majority of hits, perhaps 70%, were stopped or deflected by the layered steel plates. This was a dramatic improvement over the standard Sherman's frontal protection, which could be penetrated by German 75mm guns at virtually any combat range. The test results were promising enough that Colonel Hamrick authorized Bates to modify a platoon of 5 tanks on an experimental basis. The work would be performed at the maintenance facility, and the modified tanks would expect to be assigned to a veteran platoon led by Lieutenant Benjamin Kowalski, who had experience in tank versus tank combat and could provide informed feedback on how the modifications affected combat performance. Bates worked around the clock through the first week of January 1945, supervising a small team of welders and mechanics who helped fabricate and install the armour packages. Each tank required approximately 60 hours of work. Steel plates had to be cut to size using acetylene torches. Mounting brackets had to be fabricated and welded to the tank hulls. The heavy armour plates had to be lifted into position using improvised hoists and cranes, then welded and bolted securely enough to withstand the shock of combat and the vibration of cross-country movement. The work was physically brutal and technically demanding. Welding thick steel plates in freezing weather was difficult because the cold metal conducted heat away from the weld faster than normal, making it hard to achieve proper fusion. Bates experimented with preheating the steel using portable heaters, with mixed success. He adjusted his welding techniques, using multiple passes and higher amperage settings to ensure the welds would be strong enough. He tested each weld by striking it with a sledgehammer, a crude but effective quality control method he had learned in the coal mines. The modified tanks that emerged from Bates's workshop in mid-January were grotesque and beautiful at the same time. They looked nothing like the sleek Shermans that rolled off assembly lines in Detroit or Chicago. They looked like improvised monsters, their hulls encrusted with irregular steel plates that gave them the appearance of metallic patchwork quilts. But they were functional, and the crews who would fight in them believed the modifications would save their lives. Lieutenant Kowalski's platoon conducted training exercises with the modified tanks during the 3rd week of January, learning how the additional weight affected handling and maneuverability. The tanks were noticeably slower and less agile than standard Shermans. They could not accelerate as quickly. They could not turn as sharply. The additional weight stressed the suspension and required drivers to be more careful on slopes and soft ground where a standard Sherman might have managed without difficulty. But the crews adapted quickly. They learned to anticipate the sluggish response when accelerating. They learned to begin turns earlier to compensate for reduced agility. They learned that the modified tanks were better suited for deliberate advances, where firepower and protection mattered more than speed. And they understood, viscerally, that the crude steel plates welded to their hulls represented the difference between life and death when facing German heavy tanks. The first combat test of Bates's modified Shermans came on January 23, 1945, during an attack on German positions near the village of Schönberg. Kowalski's platoon, supported by infantry from the Second Infantry Division, advanced across open ground toward a tree line where German forces had established defensive positions. Intelligence reports indicated the presence of at least 2 German tanks in the area, possibly Panthers or Tigers, though positive identification was not available. The advance proceeded cautiously, with the 5 modified Shermans moving in a staggered line abreast formation that allowed mutual support while minimizing the chance that a single German gun could engage multiple tanks simultaneously. At approximately 1400 hours, German tanks opened fire from concealed positions in the tree line. The first round struck the lead Sherman, Kowalski's tank, on the frontal glacis plate at a range of approximately 900 meters. The impact was tremendous. Inside the tank, the crew felt the shock through the entire hull. The sound was deafening even through their headsets and the tank's armor. For an instant, Kowalski thought they had been penetrated, thought the killing, explosion, and fire were coming. But the tank continued moving. The engine still ran. No one was screaming. He looked at his crew and saw them staring back at him with expressions of shocked disbelief. They were alive. The armor had held. 2 more rounds struck Kowalski's tank in the next 30 seconds as he maneuvered toward cover. Both hit the additional armor plates, and both failed to penetrate. The German gunner, whoever he was competent and was scoring hits at a range and angle where standard Sherman armor would have been defeated easily. But Bates's improvised composite armor was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. It was stopping rounds that should have killed them. The other 4 tanks in the platoon were also taking hits. One Sherman, commanded by Staff Sergeant Raymond Burke, took a round through the turret ring, a vulnerable area that even Bates's modifications could not protect. The round penetrated into the fighting compartment, killing the gunner instantly and wounding the loader. Burke's crew bailed out immediately, abandoning the damaged tank and taking cover in a ditch beside the road. But the other 3 tanks survived multiple hits without penetration and continued advancing. At a range of approximately 400 meters, close enough that even the Sherman's 75mm gun was effective, Kowalski's gunner acquired the German tank and fired. The armor-piercing round struck the German Panther on the turret side and penetrated. The Panther shuddered, smoke poured from hatches, and the crew began bailing out. Within 2 minutes, the remaining Shermans had destroyed both German tanks, and the infantry assault resumed. The action report filed by Lieutenant Kowalski that evening documented that his platoon had taken 14 confirmed hits from German tank guns without losing a single tank to penetration. 1 tank had been knocked out by a lucky shot to an unprotected area, but 3 of its crew members had survived. The modified armor had performed far beyond expectations, and word of the success spread rapidly through the 2nd Armored Division. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Within days, battalion and regimental commanders were requesting that Bates modify additional tanks. The maintenance facility where he worked became a priority operation, with resources diverted from other tasks to support the armor modification program. Additional welders were assigned to assist Bates. Salvage operations were organized to collect suitable steel from destroyed vehicles and structures. Transportation was arranged to bring the heavy steel plates from salvage yards to the workshop. Bates trained other mechanics and welders in his techniques, sharing what he had learned through trial and error. He emphasized the importance of proper welding procedures, the need to create air gaps between armor layers, and the critical points on the Sherman hull where additional protection would provide the most benefit. He remained modest about his achievement, insisting that he had simply applied common sense and practical metalworking knowledge to an obvious problem. By early February 1945, approximately 30 tanks in the Second Armored Division had been modified with Bates's armor package or variations of it. Other American units, hearing about the modifications through informal channels, began developing their own improvised armor schemes. The 3rd Armored Division experimented with welding sections of destroyed German tank hulls to Sherman frontal armor. The 4th Armored Division fabricated armor packages using concrete and steel mesh in addition to plate steel. Each unit adapted the basic concept to its available materials and specific tactical situation. The official army response to these field modifications was initially cautious. Ordnance officers at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, reviewed reports and photographs of the modified tanks and expressed concerns about the effects of additional weight on tank suspensions, transmissions, and engines. They worried that field modifications performed without proper engineering analysis might create vulnerabilities or mechanical failures. They noted that the improvised armor violated numerous technical specifications and standards. But combat commanders, who understood that their crews were dying in inadequately protected tanks, pushed back forcefully against bureaucratic resistance. Major General Ernest Harmon, commanding the 2nd Armored Division, sent a blunt message to higher headquarters, stating that improvised armor modifications had demonstrably reduced tank losses and crew casualties, and that he would continue authorizing such modifications regardless of whether they complied with ordnance specifications. Other division commanders sent similar messages. The practical results in combat outweighed theoretical concerns about technical compliance. By mid-February 1945, informal approval had been given for continued field modifications, with the understanding that units would assume responsibility for any mechanical problems that resulted from the additional weight. This was as close to official sanction as the improvised armor program would ever receive. The United States Army, like most military organizations, preferred standardized solutions developed through formal research and testing. But the war was being fought now, in winter 1945, and soldiers were dying now, and practical solutions that saved lives took precedence over proper procedures and specifications. James Howard Bates continued his work through February and into March, modifying tanks, training other welders, refining his techniques based on combat feedback. His armor packages became progressively more sophisticated as he learned which areas of the Sherman were most vulnerable and where additional protection would provide the greatest benefit. He developed lighter weight designs that provided nearly the same protection as his original heavy packages, but with less impact on tank performance. He experimented with different steel types and thicknesses, learning through trial and error what worked and what did not. The modified tanks, whether they were called Bates tanks, armoured Shermans, or simply up-armoured vehicles, became a common sight in American armoured units, operating in the Ardennes and the Rhineland through the winter and early spring of 1945. They were never standard equipment. They were never issued through normal supply channels. They were field expedients, improvised solutions to immediate tactical problems. But they worked, and they saved lives. And for the tankers who fought in them, That was all that mattered. The port. Modified Sherman tanks rolled into combat through February and March of 1945 as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, crossing the Ruhr River, breaching the Siegfried Line, and advancing toward the Rhine. The tactical landscape had shifted dramatically since the desperate defensive battles of December and January. German forces, exhausted by the failed Ardennes offensive and bled white by months of attritional combat on two fronts, were withdrawing eastward in increasingly disorganized retreats. The Wehrmacht that had shocked the world with its blitzkrieg campaigns in 1940 and 1941 was dying. Its panzer divisions reduced to shadows of their former strength, its supply lines shattered by Allied air power, its replacement system unable to provide trained crews for the few remaining tanks. But dying armies are often the most dangerous. German units fighting on their own soil, defending towns and cities where their families lived, fought with desperation and ferocity that surprised American commanders who had expected rapid collapse. Tiger and Panther tanks, though increasingly rare as fuel shortages and mechanical breakdowns reduced German armor strength, remained lethal threats capable of destroying entire American platoons when properly positioned and competently commanded. Every river crossing, every town, every ridge line became a potential killing ground where German anti-tank guns and Panzerfaust teams waited in ambush. Lieutenant Benjamin Kowalski's platoon, now equipped entirely with Bates-modified Shermans, participated in the assault crossing of the Ruhr River on February 23, 1945. The operation was a set-piece attack involving multiple divisions, massive artillery preparation, and careful coordination between armor, infantry, and engineers. The Ruhr was not a particularly large river, perhaps 100 yards wide at the crossing site, but the Germans had demolished all bridges, established strong defensive positions on the eastern bank. American engineers would have to construct pontoon bridges under fire, while infantry and armor fought to establish a bridgehead on the far side. Kowalski's platoon crossed the river on the morning of February 24th, after engineers had completed a tactical bridge capable of supporting armor. The crossing itself was relatively uneventful, but the advance beyond the river brought immediate contact with German forces. At approximately 1000 hours, the lead American infantry companies encountered a German defensive position centered on the town of Düren, where at least 4 Tiger tanks had been positioned to cover the approaches. The Tigers opened fire at extreme range, over 1,500 meters, engaging American Shermans that were supporting the infantry advance. At that distance, even Bates's improvised armor could not reliably stop the Tiger's 88mm gun. The first American tank hit, a standard Sherman without armor modifications, exploded immediately when the German round penetrated the turret and detonated the ammunition storage. The crew had no chance to escape. Within 90 seconds, 2 more Shermans were burning. Kowalski ordered his platoon to advance into range where their guns would be effective, using terrain features for cover and presenting the hardest possible targets for the German gunners. The modified Shermans pushed forward through small arms fire and artillery, closing the range to the Tigers. German rounds struck the advancing tanks repeatedly, the impacts sending shock waves through the hulls that stunned and disoriented crews, even when penetration did not occur. One of Kowalski's tanks took 3 hits in less than a minute, each impact denting and cratering the improvised armor plates, but failing to penetrate through to the hull beneath. At 800 meters, close enough for the Sherman's 75mm gun to be marginally effective against Tiger-side armor, Kowalski's platoon began returning fire. The engagement became a brutal slugging match, American tanks trading shots with German Tigers at ranges where both sides could inflict damage. 2 of Kowalski's modified Shermans were knocked out when German rounds found weak points in the improvised armor or struck unprotected areas like the turret ring and lower hull. But the three surviving Shermans continued advancing, continued firing, continued pressing the engagement. The battle lasted nearly 40 minutes before American infantry, advancing under cover of smoke and supported by tank destroyers that engaged the Tigers from flanking positions, finally forced the German tanks to withdraw. 2 Tigers had been destroyed, their hulls burning in the streets of Duren. The other 2 withdrew eastward, probably low on ammunition or fuel. American losses were 7 Sherman tanks destroyed and 19 crewmen killed or wounded, but Kowalski's 3 surviving. Modified tanks had absorbed a total of 14 hits from German tank guns without catastrophic penetration, and their crews had survived to fight another day. The pattern repeated itself throughout the late winter and early spring campaigns. Modified Shermans took punishment that would have destroyed standard tanks, allowing American armor to close with German heavy tanks and engage them at ranges where American guns were effective. The tactical advantage was significant, but not overwhelming. The modifications did not make Shermans invulnerable. They did not solve the fundamental problem that American tanks were undergunned and under-armored compared to the best German designs. But they improved survival rates enough to matter, enough to save crews, enough to allow American numerical superiority to be brought to bear without accepting catastrophic casualties. Statistical analysis conducted after the war by Army historians attempted to quantify the effectiveness of field-modified armor. The data was incomplete, and the conclusions necessarily tentative, but the studies suggested that Shermans with improvised armor modifications experienced roughly 30 to 40% fewer catastrophic kills than unmodified tanks in similar combat situations. The survival rate for crews in modified tanks was correspondingly higher. These numbers, dry and academic in historical reports, represented hundreds of American soldiers who lived because a blacksmith from Kentucky had figured out how to weld steel plates onto tank hulls in a way that stopped German anti-tank rounds. James Howard Bates continued his work through March and into April 1945, even as the strategic situation evolved and the need for improvised armor began to diminish. The Rhine River crossing at Remagen on March 7th, where American forces captured an intact railway bridge before German engineers could destroy it, opened a direct route into the industrial heartland of Western Germany. German resistance, though still fierce in isolated pockets, was collapsing along broad sections of the front. Fuel shortages had immobilized much of the remaining German armor. The Tigers and Panthers that had dominated battlefields earlier in the war were increasingly being abandoned by their crews when they ran out of fuel or suffered mechanical breakdowns that could not be repaired. By mid-April, American forces were advancing dozens of miles per day through some sectors, racing across Germany against minimal resistance. The war in Europe was entering its final weeks. Adolf Hitler, isolated in his bunker beneath Berlin, as Soviet forces closed in from the east and American and British forces approached from the west, would commit suicide on April 30th. The unconditional surrender of German forces would follow within days, finally ending a war that had killed tens of millions and devastated an entire continent. But even in these final days, combat could be savage and deadly. German SS units and fanatical Hitler Youth defenders fought with suicidal determination in scattered engagements. American soldiers who thought they had survived the worst of the war were killed in meaningless skirmishes just days before the surrender. Every American death in late April and early May 1945 was a particular tragedy, a life lost when the end was so close that survival seemed almost guaranteed. Lieutenant Benjamin Kowalski survived the war. He fought from the Rhine to the Elbe River, where American and Soviet forces met on April 25, 1945. His modified Sherman, still bearing the improvised armor plates welded on by Sergeant Bates's crew months earlier, had absorbed 23 confirmed hits from German anti-tank weapons during the final 3 months of the war without catastrophic penetration. Kowalski credited the armor with saving his life at least 4 times. When the war ended, he returned to the United States, attended college, on the GI Bill, and eventually became a high school mathematics teacher in Pennsylvania. He kept a photograph of his Sherman tank, with its crude welded armor plates clearly visible, on the wall of his classroom for 30 years. When students asked about it, he would tell them about Sergeant Bates and explain that sometimes the most important innovations come from ordinary people who refuse to accept that problems cannot be solved. Technical Sergeant James Howard Bates received the Bronze Star Medal for meritorious service in connection with military operations against the enemy. The citation recognized his development of improvised armor modifications that enhanced the combat effectiveness and survivability of American tanks. He was also recommended for promotion to Master Sergeant, though the promotion did not come through before his discharge. Bates returned to Kentucky in October 1945 after processing through separation centers in France and New Jersey. He went back to work as a blacksmith and welder, eventually opening his own metalworking shop in Hazard that served the coal mining industry. He married, raised 4 children, and lived quietly for the remainder of his life. Unlike Curtis Culin, whose hedgerow cutter had been celebrated in newspapers and recognized by General Eisenhower, Bates received relatively little public recognition for his contribution. His modifications were never standardized, never incorporated into official Army doctrine, never mass-produced in factories. They remained field expedients, improvised solutions that worked in specific tactical situations, but did not fit neatly into the formal systems through which military innovation was supposed to occur. When military historians wrote about American armor operations in World War II, they focused on major battles, strategic decisions, and official weapons systems. The story of a blacksmith welding scrap metal onto tank hulls was a footnote, if it was mentioned at all. But the tankers who fought in Bates-modified Shermans remembered. The crews who survived hits that would have killed them in standard tanks remembered. The men who came home to their families instead of dying in burning steel coffins on some frozen field in Germany remembered. And they passed those memories to their children and grandchildren, preserving the story of how an ordinary man with practical skills and stubborn determination had given them a chance to survive when Army ordnance and official doctrine had failed them. The modified Sherman tanks themselves did not survive long after the war. Most were returned to ordnance depots in Germany and France, where the improvised armor plates were cut off and scrapped. The Army wanted to return the tanks to standard configuration before shipping them back to the United States or transferring them to other countries under military aid programs. A few of the modified tanks were photographed by Army documentation teams, and those photographs survive in the National Archives, showing the crude but functional armor packages welded to Sherman hulls. But the tanks themselves were recycled, their steel returned to the great industrial machine that had produced over 50,000 Sherman tanks during the war. The broader question of American tank design and the Sherman's inadequacy against German heavy armor became a subject of intense debate among military historians and veterans in the decades after the war. Critics argued that the United States had failed to develop tanks comparable to the German Tiger and Panther, that American tankers had been sent into combat in inferior equipment, that casualties had been unnecessarily high because Army ordnance had prioritized production numbers over combat effectiveness. Defenders of American tank policy pointed out that the Sherman was reliable, easy to maintain, and produced in quantities that overwhelmed German industry. They argued that tank versus tank combat was relatively rare, that most Sherman losses came from anti-tank guns and Panzerfaust teams rather than enemy tanks, and that the Sherman's mobility and mechanical reliability made it superior to German heavy tanks that frequently broke down or ran out of fuel. Both perspectives contained truth. The Sherman was inferior to German heavy tanks in direct combat, but superior in almost every other measure of military effectiveness. American tankers did suffer high casualties, but American industrial capacity produced replacement tanks faster than they could be destroyed. The debate, conducted in academic journals and veterans' publications, often missed the human reality that statistics could not capture. Each tank destroyed represented 5 human beings whose lives hung in the balance. Each penetrating hit meant young men burning to death or being torn apart by shrapnel. Numbers and production figures and strategic calculations meant nothing to the crew of a Sherman facing a Tiger at 800 meters. What mattered to those men, in that moment, was whether their tank could absorb the hit that was coming, whether the armor would hold, whether they would survive the next few seconds. And for the crews in Bates-modified Shermans, the answer was sometimes yes, when it would have been no in a standard tank. That difference, measured not in strategic outcomes or production statistics, but in individual human lives, was the true measure of James Howard Bates's contribution. The story of improvised tank armor in World War II became part of the larger narrative of American military innovation and adaptation. Like Curtis Coulin's hedgerow cutter, like the countless other field expedient modifications developed by soldiers facing problems their training had not prepared them for, Bates's armor package demonstrated the capacity of ordinary Americans to solve practical problems through ingenuity and determination. This capacity, more than industrial strength or numerical superiority, may have been the decisive American advantage in World War II. German forces were often technically superior in individual weapons systems. German tanks were better armed and better armored. German machine guns had higher rates of fire. German optical equipment was more precise. But German military culture, for all its emphasis on technical excellence and professional competence, was rigid and hierarchical in ways that discouraged innovation from below. German soldiers who identified problems were expected to report them through proper channels and wait for solutions to be developed by qualified experts. The idea that an enlisted man might improvise a modification to official equipment would have been nearly unthinkable in most Wehrmacht units. American military culture, by contrast, was more flexible and more willing to tolerate improvisation. American commanders, particularly at the division and corps level, were pragmatic men who cared about results more than procedures. When a blacksmith sergeant proposed welding scrap metal onto tanks, they were willing to let him try. When the modification worked, they supported its implementation, even though it violated ordnance specifications and proper procedures. This willingness to accept solutions from unexpected sources, to prioritize practical effectiveness over theoretical correctness, gave American forces an adaptive capacity that German forces could not match. The human cost of World War II in Europe is almost incomprehensible in its scale. More than 20 million Soviet citizens died, military and civilian combined. 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. German military and civilian deaths exceeded 6 million. Poland lost 17% of its entire pre-war population. Yugoslavia, Greece, and other occupied countries suffered catastrophic losses. American losses, though smaller in absolute numbers, were still staggering by any reasonable measure. Over 400,000 Americans died in all theaters of World War II. Over 100,000 of those died in the European theater alone. Among those American dead were thousands of tank crewmen who burned to death in Shermans penetrated by German anti-tank weapons. Young men from every state, every background, every community in America. Farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit and college students from New England. They died in France and Belgium and Germany, far from home, in machines that could not adequately protect them from the weapons they faced. Their deaths were not meaningless. They died fighting to liberate Europe from Nazi tyranny, fighting to end the Holocaust, fighting to defeat an evil regime that had plunged the world into the most destructive war in human history. But each death was a tragedy, a future erased, a family shattered. The modifications developed by James Howard Bates could not prevent all those deaths. They could not solve the fundamental problem of Sherman, vulnerability. They could not turn American medium tanks into the equivalents of German Tigers. But they saved some lives, in some battles, in some moments when the difference between survival and death came down to whether a steel plate 3 inches thick could stop an 88mm round. For the men who survived because of that difference, Bates was a savior whose name they would remember for the rest of their lives. In 1973, James Howard Bates died in Hazard, Kentucky at the age of 63. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service, but did not detail his contribution to American tank operations in World War II. Most people in his community knew him as a skilled metalworker, a reliable businessman, a good neighbor. Few knew that 3 decades earlier, his improvised armor modifications had saved American lives in the final campaigns against Nazi Germany. He was buried with military honors in a small cemetery outside Hazard, his grave marked with a standard Veterans Administration headstone that listed his rank and years of service, but said nothing about innovation or improvisation or the crude steel plates that had stopped German rounds. The legacy of improvised field modifications in military operations continued long after World War II ended. During the Korean War, American tank crews welded sandbags and spare track to their vehicles for additional protection. In Vietnam, armored vehicle crews developed improvised armor packages to protect against mines and rocket-propelled grenades. In Iraq and Afghanistan, American soldiers welded scrap metal to Humvees and trucks before the Army eventually developed purpose-built armored vehicles. The pattern repeated across decades and wars. Soldiers facing threats their equipment was not designed to counter would improvise protection using whatever materials were available, and pragmatic commanders would support those improvisations even when they violated official specifications. Each generation of soldiers rediscovered what James Howard Bates and countless others had demonstrated in World War II, that survival sometimes depends on the willingness to improvise, to adapt, to refuse to accept that problems cannot be solved. That formal training and proper procedures are important but insufficient when facing real combat. That the most valuable military capability is not technology or firepower, but the human capacity to think clearly under pressure and develop practical solutions to immediate problems. The modified Sherman tanks that rolled into Germany in the spring of 1945, their hulls encrusted with welded steel plates, represented something more significant than a tactical innovation. They represented the American spirit of practical problem-solving, the democratic conviction that good ideas can come from any source, regardless of rank or credentials, and the fundamental decency of a nation that values the lives of its soldiers enough to accept unconventional solutions that might save them. These values, more than industrial capacity or military power, were what ultimately defeated Nazi Germany and preserved freedom in Europe. The war ended on May 8, 1945, when German forces surrendered unconditionally. The guns fell silent across Europe for the first time in 6 years. American soldiers, British soldiers, Canadian soldiers, French soldiers, soldiers from dozens of nations who had fought to defeat Nazi tyranny could finally hope to go home. The cost had been immeasurable. The suffering had been beyond comprehension. But evil had been defeated, and the world had been saved from a darkness that threatened to consume all human decency. Among those who survived to see that victory were tank crews who owed their lives to improvised armor welded onto their Shermans by a blacksmith from Kentucky. They came home, returned to their families, built lives and careers, and raised children who, would never fully understand what their fathers had endured. And sometimes, late at night or in quiet moments, they would remember the sound of German rounds striking their tanks, the impact that should have killed them but did not, the crude steel plates that had stood between them and death. They would remember, and they would be grateful to a man whose name most of them never knew, who had saved them with nothing more than welding torches, scrap metal, and an unwillingness to accept that young Americans should die in inadequately protected tanks when something could be done about it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.